My husband's voice cut through the birthday celebration like a blade. Take Tommy and leave. Right now. The 4 words that would destroy everything I thought I knew about my life came without warning, without explanation, delivered in a tone I'd never heard from FBI Agent Daniel Montgomery in our 10 years of marriage. Pure, controlled terror. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. 30 seconds earlier, I'd been laughing with my family at my mother's 65th birthday dinner in Riverside Heights, watching my 8-year-old son Tommy help his grandfather cut the chocolate cake. The dining room buzzed with warmth and wine, stories flowing as freely as the champagne my brother had brought from France. It was supposed to be perfect, everyone together for the first time in months, the kind of evening that makes you grateful for the quiet suburban life you've built. Now I stood frozen in the hallway, staring at my phone's black screen, my heart hammering against my ribs as Daniel's words echoed in my mind. No greeting, no explanation, just that clipped, urgent command that made my blood turn to ice water. In 6 years of marriage to a counterterrorism agent, I'd learned to recognize the difference between work stress and genuine fear. This was the latter. I'm Rachel Montgomery, and until that phone call, I thought I had it all figured out. Forensic accountant for the state prosecutor's office, mother to the most amazing kid in Cedar Falls, married to a man who kept our country safe from threats I could barely imagine. We had Sunday barbecues, soccer practice on Wednesdays, and the kind of life that felt earned after years of Daniel's dangerous overseas assignments. But as I forced my feet to move back toward the celebration, one thought kept circling through my mind like a vulture: Daniel never called during family gatherings. Not unless something was catastrophically, life-alteringly wrong. The sound of my daughter's laughter mixed with the clinking of wine glasses as I stepped back into the dining room, trying to keep my face neutral while my world tilted off its axis. Family photos lined the walls, graduations, weddings, Tommy's first steps. Everything looked so normal, so safe. The smell of my mother's famous pot roast still lingered in the air, mixing with the vanilla candles she always lit for special occasions. "Everything okay, sweetheart?" my mother asked, her intuitive eyes catching the tension I was desperately trying to hide. Mothers always know. "Yeah, just. Daniel's flight got delayed," I lied, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "We might need to head out soon to pick him up." The lie came so easily it frightened me. But some instinct, honed from years of being married to someone who dealt in classified dangers, told me to trust Daniel's warning. Even when it made no sense. Even when leaving meant abandoning the one place that had always felt completely safe. Tommy was sitting next to my father, chocolate frosting smeared across his cheek, completely oblivious to the fact that our lives had just been turned upside down. "Tommy," I called softly, my voice steadier than I felt. "Come on, buddy. We need to go get Daddy." He looked up with those bright blue eyes that mirrored Daniel's exactly. "But we haven't finished cake yet." "We'll take some with us," I promised, scanning the room one last time. My family's faces glowed with contentment and wine, their laughter a stark contrast to the terror clawing at my chest. As my son obediently gathered his things from the coat closet, chattering about whether Daddy would want chocolate or vanilla cake, I caught my mother's concerned gaze across the room. "Drive safe," she said quietly, kissing my cheek. "And call me when you get home." I nodded, knowing I might not be going home at all. The October air hit us like a slap when we stepped outside. Cedar Falls always carried that crisp bite in autumn, but tonight it felt particularly sharp, particularly final. As I buckled Tommy into his booster seat, I scanned the quiet suburban street with new eyes, and that's when I saw it. A dark sedan parked 3 houses down, engine running, exhaust visible in the cold air. As I stared, the headlights flicked on and off once, like a signal. My blood turned to ice water. Someone was watching us. I started my SUV with shaking hands, backing out of my mother's driveway while my son hummed contentedly in the back seat. In the rearview mirror, warm yellow light spilled from my childhood home's windows, silhouettes of my family still visible as they continued their celebration, completely unaware that I was potentially fleeing for our lives. It was the last time I would see that house the same way. The last moment before everything I thought I knew about trust family, and safety crumbled into dust. As we drove into the darkness, Tommy asked sleepily, "Mom, why does Daddy sound different on the phone lately?" I gripped the steering wheel tighter, realizing my 8-year-old had noticed something I'd been trying to ignore. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "He sounds scared." Out of the mouths of babes. Because Daniel had been scared. And now, driving through the suburban streets of Cedar Falls with no destination and no plan, I was beginning to understand why. Whatever my FBI husband had stumbled onto, whatever had made his voice crack with barely controlled terror, it was big enough to make him sacrifice everything, including the safety of a grandmother's birthday party, to keep us alive. The real question was, who were we running from, and how long did we have before they found us? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The drive through Cedar Falls felt like navigating through a nightmare. Every intersection, every streetlight, every parked car could be hiding danger I couldn't see. Tommy had fallen asleep in his booster seat within 10 minutes, his small hand still clutching the plastic container of birthday cake my mother had insisted we take. The innocent normalcy of it, chocolate cake in Tupperware, felt surreal against the backdrop of whatever terror had seized my husband. I pulled into the parking lot of a 24-hour diner on Route 7, hands still trembling as I turned off the engine. The neon sign buzzed and flickered, casting pink shadows across the empty asphalt. I needed to think, to process what Daniel had said, to figure out what came next. But first, I needed to try calling him back. The phone rang once. Twice. Then his voicemail, "You've reached Agent Montgomery. Leave a message." The same professional greeting he'd used for years, but now it sounded like a ghost. "Daniel, it's me," I whispered, glancing back at Tommy's sleeping form. "I did what you said. We left Mom's. But I need to know what's happening. Please call me back." 5 minutes passed. Nothing. I tried again. This time, he answered on the first ring. "Rachel." His voice was different now, not the controlled terror from before, but something worse. Exhaustion mixed with desperation. "Where are you?" I asked. "Somewhere safe. For now." Static crackled through the line. "Listen carefully. Do not go home. Do not contact anyone from work. Do not use credit cards. Do you have cash?" "My purse." I fumbled through it with one hand. "About $200. "Daniel, you're scaring me." "What is this about?" "There's a storage unit in Millbrook. Facility called Secure Store on Industrial Boulevard. Unit 247. The code is Tommy's birthday, 0418. There's an envelope taped under the bottom shelf. Take it, read it, but don't open anything else until you're somewhere completely secure." I grabbed a napkin from the glove compartment and scribbled down the information. "A storage unit? Daniel, what's in there?" "Proof," he said quietly. "Proof that I've been investigating the wrong people for the wrong reasons. And proof that some very dangerous individuals know I've figured it out." The line went quiet except for the sound of his breathing. In the background, I could hear what sounded like traffic, maybe a truck stop or highway rest area. 3 months ago, I was assigned to investigate a domestic terrorism cell. Financial transactions, weapons purchases, communications intercepts. Standard counterterrorism work. His voice dropped even lower. But the evidence trail kept leading back to people it shouldn't lead back to. People in law enforcement. People in government. People I've worked with for years. My blood went cold. What kind of people? The kind who can make an FBI agent disappear without anyone asking questions. The kind who have access to federal databases, surveillance equipment, and the kind of resources that make running very, very difficult. I thought about the sedan outside my mother's house, the way those headlights had flicked on and off like a signal. "Daniel, are we being watched?" "I have to assume yes. Which is why you can't go home, why you can't contact family, why you need to stay off the grid until I can figure out how deep this goes. How deep what goes? Silence stretched between us. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. Rachel, I think there's a network. Law enforcement, maybe federal agents, maybe higher than that. People who've been using their positions to facilitate something big. Something that makes domestic terrorism look like a parking ticket. The diner's neon sign flickered, casting strange shadows across my windshield. Tommy stirred in the back seat but didn't wake up. I watched his peaceful face and felt something fierce and protective surge through me. What do you need me to do? I asked. Get the envelope from the storage unit. There are instructions inside. And Rachel. His voice caught slightly. Whatever happens, whatever you read in that envelope, know that everything I've done has been to protect you and Tommy. Even if it doesn't look that way. What do you mean it might not look that way? But the line had gone dead again. I sat in the diner parking lot for another 20 minutes, watching late-night truckers come and go, normal people living normal lives while my world collapsed around me. Finally, I started the engine and pulled back onto Route 7, heading toward Millbrook. The storage facility was a sprawling complex of metal buildings surrounded by chain-link fence. At 11:47 p.m., it was completely deserted except for the security lights that cast harsh white circles every 50 feet. I drove slowly through the rows until I found Building D, then counted down to Unit 247. The code worked. Daniel's birthday, our son's birthday, the date that had once represented the beginning of our little family and now felt like it might mark the end of everything we'd built together. The unit was small, maybe 8 by 10 feet, filled with boxes and furniture I didn't recognize. But taped under the bottom shelf, exactly where Daniel had said, was a manila envelope marked, "If something happens to me." Inside, there were photographs. Dozens of them. Federal agents I recognized from Daniel's Christmas parties, shaking hands with men in expensive suits. Meeting in parking garages, passing briefcases, sitting in expensive restaurants with people whose faces I didn't know but whose body language screamed money and power. And then I found the photo that made my hands shake. My own supervisor at the prosecutor's office, Assistant District Attorney Michael Brennan, sitting across from a man whose face I'd seen on wanted posters. A man suspected of running weapons to cartels across the Mexican border. They were laughing, raising glasses in what looked like a toast. Brennan. The man who'd hired me, who'd mentored me, who'd been to our house for barbecues and knew where we lived, where Tommy went to school, where my mother lived. The man who had access to every case file I'd ever worked on, including several involving financial crimes connected to weapons trafficking. At the bottom of the envelope was a single sheet of paper in Daniel's handwriting. They know you've seen the evidence. They know you can read financial records they can't. And they know that keeping you alive is no longer worth the risk. I'm sorry. I never meant for this to touch you. D. I sank onto the concrete floor of the storage unit, photographs scattered around me like pieces of a puzzle I'd never wanted to solve. Everything made sense now. The late nights Daniel had been working, the stress I'd attributed to normal job pressure, the way he'd been asking casual questions about my current cases. He hadn't been investigating a terrorist cell. He'd been investigating a corruption network that reached into the highest levels of federal law enforcement. And somehow, I'd become part of the evidence trail. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "We know where you are. You have 20 minutes to disappear before we find you. This is the only warning you'll get." I gathered the photographs, stuffed them back in the envelope, and ran for my car. Tommy was just waking up as I started the engine, confused and sleepy. "Mom? Where are we?" "Just running an errand for Daddy," I said, my voice somehow steady even though my hands were shaking on the steering wheel. "Go back to sleep, baby." As I pulled out of the storage facility, I caught a glimpse of headlights in the distance, moving fast toward the entrance. I pressed the accelerator and disappeared into the night, no longer just running from unknown danger, but from people who knew exactly who I was and exactly what I could do to destroy them. The real terror wasn't the running anymore. It was the realization that my normal life, my job, my colleagues, my daily routine, had been a lie. I'd been working alongside the very people my husband was risking his life to expose. And now they knew I knew. I drove through the night with no destination, just the desperate need to put distance between us and whoever had sent that text. Tommy slept fitfully in the back seat, occasionally mumbling in his dreams about birthday cake and his grandfather's fishing stories. The normalcy of his child's concerns felt like a knife in my chest. At 2 a.m., I pulled into a truck stop outside the small town of Oakville, 40 miles from the storage facility. The parking lot was full of 18-wheelers, their diesel engines rumbling like sleeping giants. Anonymous, transient, the perfect place to disappear for a few hours. I parked between two massive trucks and tried to think clearly for the first time since Daniel's call. The envelope sat on the passenger seat like a loaded weapon. I pulled out the photographs again, studying them under the dim dome light. Michael Brennan's face smiled back at me from multiple images, always well-dressed, always confident, always with men whose expensive suits couldn't quite hide the predatory look in their eyes. In one photo, he was handing over what looked like a thick folder to a man I now recognized from wanted posters as Carlos Vega, suspected of running one of the largest weapons trafficking operations on the East Coast. My hands shook as I realized the implications. For the past 3 years, I'd been providing financial analysis for cases involving money laundering, weapons trafficking, and organized crime. Cases that Michael Brennan had personally assigned to me. Cases where my forensic accounting skills had uncovered patterns and connections that... Oh God. I grabbed my work laptop from the back seat and powered it up using the truck stop's Wi-Fi. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I accessed case files I'd worked on over the past year. The Morrison case, a supposed money laundering operation we'd been investigating. I'd traced the financial connections through 3 shell companies, identified the key players, mapped out the entire network. The case had been quietly dropped 6 months ago due to insufficient evidence. The Riverside arms bust, I'd followed the money trail from a weapons seizure all the way back to a legitimate-seeming import business. That case had also been dropped, right after I'd submitted my final report. The Clearwater investigation, millions of dollars flowing through veterans' charity organizations, which I'd traced back to offshore accounts. Another case that had mysteriously lost momentum just as we were closing in on the source. Every single case where my analysis had gotten too close to the truth had been buried. And Michael Brennan had been the one making those decisions. I wasn't just a forensic accountant. I was an unwitting intelligence asset, feeding information directly to the very network Daniel was trying to expose. They'd been using my skills to stay one step ahead of legitimate investigations, to identify which operations were getting too much attention, to know when to shut down and relocate. My phone rang, startling me so badly I nearly dropped the laptop. Unknown number again. Hello, Rachel. The voice was smooth, cultured, with just a hint of an accent I couldn't place. I hope you and Tommy are having a pleasant evening drive. Ice water flooded my veins. Who is this? Someone who's been watching your career with great interest. Your work on the Riverside case was particularly illuminating. You have quite a talent for following money trails. I looked around the truck stop parking lot, suddenly feeling exposed despite being surrounded by massive vehicles. What do you want? The same thing your husband wants, actually. To keep you and your son safe. The difference is, I'm in a position to guarantee that safety. By threatening us? A soft chuckle. By offering you a choice. You see, Rachel, you've stumbled into something much larger than a simple corruption investigation. Your husband has been interfering with operations that have taken years to establish, operations that serve purposes beyond anything he could understand. What kind of purposes? The kind that keep America safe from threats that never make the evening news. The kind that require creative funding solutions. The kind that sometimes necessitate working with people who exist in moral gray areas. I thought about the photographs, about Carlos Vega and the other men whose faces belonged on wanted posters. You're talking about working with criminals. I'm talking about working with whoever is necessary to maintain the balance of power in an increasingly dangerous world. Your husband sees corruption where more sophisticated people see pragmatism. A trucker walked past my window, talking loudly on his cell phone about delivery schedules and highway traffic. Normal people living normal lives, oblivious to the shadow world I was being pulled into. "What do you want from me?" I asked. "Continue your work. Provide your analyses. Help us identify threats to our operations before they become problems. In exchange, we ensure your family's safety and your husband's eventual exoneration." "And if I refuse?" The pause stretched long enough for me to hear Tommy shift in the back seat, mumbling something about wanting to go home. "Then you'll spend the rest of your lives running from people who have unlimited resources and very long memories. Daniel thought he was protecting you by exposing us. Instead, he's painted targets on all of your backs." I closed my eyes, trying to think clearly through the terror and exhaustion. "You're asking me to betray everything I believe in. I'm asking you to be practical. You've already been working for us for 3 years, Rachel. The only difference is now you know it." The laptop screen showed another case file, another investigation I'd helped derail without knowing it. He was right, and that knowledge felt like acid in my stomach. "I need time to think." "Of course. But not too much time. Events are moving quickly, and your husband's activities have forced certain accelerations in our timeline. We'll be in touch within 24 hours for your answer." The line went dead. I sat in the truck stop parking lot until dawn, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of orange and pink while my son slept peacefully in the back seat. Everything I thought I knew about my life, my work, my purpose, had been stripped away in the span of 6 hours. I wasn't a public servant fighting for justice. I was an unwitting collaborator in a network that traded in violence and corruption, a network that had been using my own skills against me. The worst part was realizing they were probably right about having no choice. People with the resources to track us to a random truck stop in the middle of the night, people who knew our every movement and could reach us anywhere, weren't going to simply disappear if we said no. But there was something the voice on the phone hadn't considered. Daniel had taught me more than just how to spot surveillance and recognize danger. He'd taught me that sometimes the only way to protect your family is to fight back, even when the odds are impossible. As Tommy stirred awake, asking sleepily where we were and when we could go home, I made a decision that would either save us or destroy us completely. I wasn't going to run anymore, and I wasn't going to be anyone's unwitting asset. I was going to find Daniel, pool our resources, and burn this entire network to the ground. Even if it killed us all in the process. "Mom?" Tommy's voice was small and confused as he looked around at the truck stop. "Are we in trouble?" I turned to face my beautiful, innocent son, and for the first time since Daniel's call, I smiled. Not because I wasn't scared, but because I'd finally found something more powerful than fear, purpose. "No, baby," I said, starting the engine. "But some bad people are about to be." The decision to stop running came with a price I wasn't prepared to pay. By 7 a.m., I'd made 3 critical moves that would either save my family or sign our death warrants. First, I'd driven to a pawn shop in downtown Oakville and traded my wedding ring for an untraceable prepaid phone. The elderly clerk had looked at me with sympathy, probably assuming I was another desperate woman fleeing an abusive relationship. He wasn't entirely wrong. Second, I'd withdrawn the maximum daily limit from 3 different ATMs using 3 different cards, knowing each transaction was being tracked but needing the cash more than I needed anonymity. 24 hours of financial invisibility was all I could buy, and I intended to make them count. Third, and most dangerously, I'd called Michael Brennan. "Rachel?" His voice carried the perfect blend of concern and surprise. "Where are you? We've been worried sick. When you didn't come in yesterday and didn't answer your phone." "I need to see you," I said, watching Tommy color in a children's activity book at a McDonald's booth. "There's something about the Morrison case I need to discuss. Something I found in the files that doesn't make sense." A pause. Too long. Too calculated. "Of course. Why don't you come in around 10? We can go over whatever's troubling you." "Not the office. Too many people, too many interruptions." "What about Riverside Park? The old pavilion where they used to hold concerts?" "Noon. Another pause. Rachel, is everything all right? You sound different. I forced a laugh. Just tired. Late night going through files. You know how I get when I find inconsistencies in the numbers. Yes, he said quietly. I do know how you get. The way he said it sent chills down my spine. Because Michael Brennan did know exactly how I got when I found inconsistencies. He'd been watching me discover them for 3 years, then systematically burying every case where my analysis got too close to the truth. After hanging up, I spent the next 4 hours preparing for what would either be a confrontation or my execution. I made copies of the photographs at a print shop, sealed them in envelopes, and mailed them to 3 different addresses. One to my mother with instructions to give it to the FBI if anything happened to me, one to the Washington Post investigative desk, and one to a safety deposit box I'd opened under a false name using an old college ID. By 11:30, I'd positioned myself on a hill overlooking Riverside Park with a pair of binoculars I'd bought at a sporting goods store. Tommy thought we were bird watching. In a way, we were watching for predators. The park was nearly empty on a Wednesday afternoon. A few joggers, an elderly man feeding ducks by the pond, a maintenance worker emptying trash cans. The old concert pavilion sat in the center, a wooden structure with peeling paint and graffiti-covered pillars. I'd chosen it because it offered clear sight lines in all directions and multiple exit routes. At 11:50, the first black sedan appeared. At 11:55, the second one arrived from the opposite direction. At 11:58, I watched Michael Brennan emerge from a third vehicle, a silver BMW I'd ridden in dozens of times to court appearances and business lunches. He looked exactly the same as always, well-dressed, confident, carrying himself with the authority of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in the room. Except today, he wasn't alone. 2 men in dark suits flanked him as he walked toward the pavilion. They moved with the fluid precision of people trained in violence, their eyes constantly scanning the area. Professional bodyguards or professional killers, at this point, the distinction seemed academic. I had to give Michael credit. He'd come prepared for either a negotiation or a cleanup operation. What he hadn't prepared for was the possibility that I wouldn't show up at all. Instead, I used the prepaid phone to call his number while watching him through the binoculars. He answered on the first ring. I can see you, I said. And I can see your friends. His head swiveled, searching. Even from a distance, I could read the frustration in his body language. Rachel, where are you? We need to talk. We're talking now. And I can see everything I need to see. 3 cars, 6 men total, all positioned to control the area. This isn't a meeting, Michael. It's an ambush. He stopped walking and stood perfectly still in the center of the pavilion. You don't understand what you've gotten yourself into. I understand enough. I understand you've been using me to sabotage investigations for 3 years. I understand the Morrison case was killed because my analysis would have exposed your friends. I understand Carlos Vega isn't just some arms dealer you're investigating, he's your business partner. Rachel, listen to me very carefully. You're operating with incomplete information. Yes, there are arrangements that exist outside normal channels. But they exist for reasons beyond anything you could comprehend. I watched him gesture to one of his men, who immediately began walking toward the parking area where my car had been earlier. Good thing I'd moved it. Try me, I said. Explain how working with arms dealers serves the greater good. Do you know how many terrorist attacks have been prevented in the last 5 years? How many weapons shipments have been interdicted? How many cells have been infiltrated and destroyed? His voice was rising now, passionate in a way I'd rarely heard. The official channels are too slow, too bureaucratic, too constrained by politicians who've never seen real violence. So you decided to become the violence. I decided to do whatever was necessary to protect American lives. Sometimes that means working with people who operate outside the law. Sometimes it means using resources that don't appear in any federal budget. And sometimes it means employing talented people like you without their knowledge. I watched the man searching the parking area return and shake his head. Michael's shoulders tensed with frustration. Where's my husband, Michael? Safe. For now. But his safety, and yours, depends entirely on your willingness to be reasonable. The words hit me like a physical blow. You have Daniel. Daniel is in protective custody while we sort out this misunderstanding. He's been investigating legitimate targets, Rachel. The problem is, he's been investigating them using methods that threaten ongoing operations vital to national security. What kind of operations? The kind that keep weapons out of the hands of people who would use them to kill American civilians. The kind that identify terrorist funding sources and cut them off at the root. The kind that sometimes require cooperation with individuals who exist in moral gray areas. I thought about the photographs, about the men in expensive suits shaking hands with federal agents. You're talking about Carlos Vega. About using criminals to fight other criminals. I'm talking about using whatever resources are available to win a war that most Americans don't even know is being fought. Through the binoculars, I could see Michael pacing now, his usual composure cracking. The two men with him were growing restless, constantly checking their watches and scanning the area. And what about the money, Michael? What about the millions flowing through those shell companies I traced? Was that all for national security too? Silence. Long enough for me to count 6 heartbeats. Operations require funding, Rachel. Funding that doesn't appear in congressional budgets or leave paper trails that can be subpoenaed. So you're stealing government money to fund your private war. I'm redirecting resources to where they can do the most good. I close my eyes, feeling the last of my illusions crumble. Michael Brennan, the man who'd mentored me, who'd taught me to see patterns in financial data, who'd been like a father figure in my professional life, was a criminal. Not a misguided patriot or a well-intentioned public servant who'd lost his way. A criminal who'd been using my skills to protect his operation while destroying anyone who got too close to the truth. Including my husband. I want Daniel back, I said. And I want out. That's not possible. You know too much, you've seen too much, and you're too valuable an asset to simply walk away. Then we have a problem. Yes, Michael said quietly. We do. I watched him signal to his men. They began moving toward the edges of the park, taking positions that would allow them to search the surrounding area systematically. Professional, methodical, patient. But they were looking for someone who was already gone. I'd made my choice the moment I saw those cars arrive. There would be no negotiation, no compromise, no trading my silence for my family's safety. Michael Brennan and his network had made one crucial mistake. They'd underestimated how far a mother would go to protect her child and save her husband. As I gathered Tommy and our belongings, preparing to disappear again, I realized the game had fundamentally changed. I was no longer running from unknown threats or trying to piece together a puzzle I didn't understand. Now I knew exactly who my enemies were, what they wanted, and what they were capable of. More importantly, I knew they had Daniel, which meant the running was over. The hunting had begun. The 24 hours after my confrontation with Michael changed everything I thought I knew about survival. I'd spent my entire adult life believing that problems could be solved through proper channels, that justice existed somewhere in the system if you just knew how to navigate it correctly. Now I understood that sometimes the system itself was the problem, and the only way to save your family was to become something you'd never imagined you could be. I started with what I knew, financial patterns. If Michael Brennan's network was redirecting government resources to fund their operations, there would be a trail. Money always left tracks, no matter how carefully it was laundered. The question was whether I could follow those tracks fast enough to find Daniel before they decided he was too dangerous to keep alive. Using the laptop and a secure internet connection at the Oakville Public Library, I began dissecting every case I'd worked on in the past 3 years. Not just the obvious ones like Morrison and Riverside, but every single financial analysis, every money trail I'd traced, every connection I'd identified. I fed Tommy quarters for the vending machine and told him Mommy was working on a very important project while I systematically deconstructed my own career. The pattern that emerged made my stomach turn. It wasn't random corruption or opportunistic theft. It was systematic, sophisticated, and far larger than I'd imagined. Michael's network had been using legitimate federal investigations as cover for their own operations, redirecting seized assets, manipulating evidence, and eliminating anyone who got close to the truth. The money flowed through a complex web of shell companies, charity organizations, and private security firms, but it all led back to one place, a private military contractor called Blackstone Security Solutions. Blackstone didn't officially exist. No corporate filings, no public records, no website. But their financial footprint was enormous. Millions of dollars in government contracts, payment authorizations signed by high-ranking federal officials, and most tellingly, a pattern of transactions that coincided perfectly with the cases I'd worked on that had been mysteriously dropped. More disturbing was what I found when I cross-referenced Blackstone's activities with news reports from the past 5 years. Every major arms bust, every terrorist financing investigation, every high-profile arrest that had been credited to federal law enforcement, they all had one thing in common. Evidence that could have exposed Blackstone's involvement had been carefully sanitized from the official reports. They weren't just stealing money. They were rewriting history. At 3 p.m., Tommy tugged on my sleeve. "Mom, I'm hungry. And this place smells weird." He was right. The library's combination of old books and industrial carpet cleaner was starting to make me nauseous. Or maybe that was the stress of realizing I'd been an unwitting participant in a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of federal law enforcement. "Okay, baby. Let's get some lunch." We walked to a diner 2 blocks away, a place called Maggie's that looked like it hadn't been updated since 1975. Red vinyl booths, black and white checkered floor, the smell of bacon grease and coffee that had been brewing too long. Tommy ordered grilled cheese and chocolate milk. I ordered coffee I couldn't drink and tried to figure out my next move. That's when I saw him. Agent Kevin Torres from Daniel's FBI unit, sitting alone in a corner booth, wearing civilian clothes and reading a newspaper. He glanced up as we entered, and I saw the flicker of recognition in his eyes before he looked back down at his paper. Kevin had been to our house for barbecues. He'd played catch with Tommy in our backyard. He'd been Daniel's partner on 3 major cases, including one where Daniel had mentioned Kevin's concerns about evidence handling procedures. Evidence handling procedures that had been overseen by Michael Brennan's office. I made a decision that was either brilliant or suicidal. Instead of running, I walked straight to Kevin's booth. "Mind if we sit?" I asked, sliding in across from him before he could answer. Tommy climbed in beside me, immediately fascinated by the ancient jukebox at the end of the table. Kevin folded his newspaper slowly. "Rachel. I heard you and Tommy were visiting family." "Cut the shit, Kevin. Where's my husband?" His eyes flicked to Tommy, then back to me. "I think we should talk privately. I think you should answer my question. Daniel called me 3 nights ago and told me to run. Since then, I've discovered that my supervisor has been running a criminal enterprise using federal resources, and that my husband has apparently disappeared while investigating it. So I'll ask again, where is Daniel?" Kevin was quiet for a long moment, studying my face. Finally, he leaned forward and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Daniel's safe. But he's not in federal custody, and he's not coming home anytime soon." "What does that mean?" "It means he uncovered something big enough that certain people decided he needed to disappear permanently. The official story is that he's been reassigned to a classified operation overseas. The truth is, he's in a private facility run by Blackstone Security." The name hit me like a physical blow. "You know about Blackstone?" Kevin's expression didn't change, but I saw his hand move slightly toward his jacket. "I know a lot of things, Rachel. The question is, how much do you know?" I thought about the flash drive hidden in my purse, the copies of photographs I'd mailed to 3 different locations, the financial analysis that could expose the entire network. Enough to destroy everyone involved. Including me? The question hung in the air like smoke. Tommy was pushing buttons on the jukebox, humming to himself, completely oblivious to the fact that his mother was potentially sitting across from another enemy. "That depends," I said carefully. "Are you part of Brennan's network?" Kevin laughed, but there was no humor in it. Brennan's network. Is that what you think this is? Financial records don't lie, Kevin. Money trail leads straight back to Blackstone, and Blackstone has been profiting from every investigation that gets buried. You're right about the money. But you're wrong about who's running the show. Kevin glanced around the diner, then leaned closer. Michael Brennan isn't the head of this operation, Rachel. He's middle management. The real power sits much higher up the food chain. How high? High enough that making an FBI agent disappear requires nothing more than a few keystrokes and a convincing cover story. I felt the ground shifting beneath me again. If you know all this, why haven't you done anything? Because I'm one man against a system that's been in place for over a decade. Because every time someone tries to expose it, they end up dead or disappeared. And because until 3 days ago, I didn't have proof. What happened 3 days ago? Kevin reached into his jacket and pulled out a small recording device. Daniel gave me this before they took him. It's a conversation between Brennan and someone identified only as the director. They're discussing something called Operation Darkwater, a plan to eliminate everyone who's gotten too close to Blackstone's activities. My blood turned to ice. Including us. Including your family, me, 2 other agents, and at least 6 civilians who've stumbled across pieces of the puzzle. They're calling it a security consolidation. I looked at Tommy, still innocently playing with the jukebox, and felt something cold and hard settle in my chest. When? Soon. The recording is dated 2 days ago. Daniel managed to get word to me about the timeline before they moved him to the facility. What facility? Where is he? Kevin slid a folded piece of paper across the table. Private compound in the Virginia mountains. Officially, it's a corporate retreat center. Unofficially, it's where Blackstone handles their security problems. I opened the paper. It contained an address, a rough map, and a note in Daniel's handwriting. They think I'm broken. Use that. He wants me to come after him. He wants you to save yourselves. But if you're determined to do something stupid. Kevin paused, glancing at Tommy again. There might be a way to get him out. But it would require you to do things you've never done before. What kind of things? Kevin's expression was grim. The kind that turned forensic accountants into federal fugitives. I thought about the past 72 hours, about how my quiet suburban life had been stripped away piece by piece until nothing remained but the desperate need to protect my family. I thought about Michael Brennan's betrayal, about the network that had been using my skills to destroy innocent lives, about my husband locked away in some private prison while powerful men decided whether we deserved to live. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. Tell me what I need to do. Kevin's plan was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. Over the next hour, sitting in that greasy diner while Tommy worked his way through 3 different desserts, the FBI agent laid out a strategy that would either free my husband or get us all killed in the process. The facility is called Mountain View Corporate Center, Kevin explained, sketching a rough diagram on napkins. 37 acres in the Blue Ridge Mountains, officially owned by a consulting firm that doesn't actually consult on anything. Security is tight but not impenetrable. The real challenge isn't getting in, it's getting out with Daniel and staying alive long enough to expose everything. I studied the crude map, trying to reconcile the innocent-sounding name with the reality of what Kevin was describing. How many people are we talking about? Guards? Maybe 8 to 12 on any given shift. But they're not mall security, Rachel. These are former military, special operations types. The kind of people who shoot first and never bother with questions. And you think the 3 of us can just walk in there? Kevin's laugh was bitter. The 3 of us? No. But a grieving widow whose husband died in a classified operation overseas, coming to collect his personal effects from the secure facility where they were being stored? That might work. The plan crystallized as he spoke. Kevin had access to Daniel's personnel file, and more importantly, to the bureaucratic machinery that could create convincing documentation. A death certificate would be easy enough to fabricate. Special operations personnel died in classified circumstances all the time. A cover story about personal effects being stored at a secure facility for eventual return to family would hold up under casual scrutiny. The key is selling the performance, Kevin continued. You're not Rachel Montgomery, forensic accountant and federal fugitive. You're Rachel Montgomery, widow and grieving mother, too overwhelmed by grief to think clearly about security protocols or ask inconvenient questions. What about Tommy? He stays with me. Far away from this. If something goes wrong. Nothing's going wrong, I said firmly. Because if it does, my son becomes an orphan. Kevin nodded grimly. Which is why we need to do this right. One chance, in and out, no room for improvisation. The technical details were surprisingly straightforward. Kevin would generate the paperwork through legitimate channels: death certificate, facility notification, appointment scheduling. The bureaucracy that protected Blackstone's operations would also provide cover for penetrating them. I would arrive at the scheduled time, sign the required forms, and be escorted to wherever they were holding Daniel under the pretense of collecting his belongings. The hard part would be everything that happened after that. Security cameras throughout the facility, Kevin warned. Motion sensors on all exterior doors. Armed guards who shoot to kill if they suspect anything unusual. And that's assuming Daniel is even in condition to travel. I didn't want to think about what condition to travel might mean. Instead, I focused on the parts of the plan I could control. What about extraction? Once I find him, how do we get out? That's where things get complicated. Kevin spread out a more detailed map he'd printed from satellite imagery. The facility sits in a valley with only one road in and out. They'll have checkpoints, probably armed patrols. Running isn't really an option. So what is? We create a distraction. Something big enough to draw security away from the main building, long enough for you to get Daniel and reach the extraction point. What kind of distraction? Kevin met my eyes. The kind that burns. The idea was insane. Kevin would position himself on the ridge overlooking the facility with military-grade incendiary devices he claimed he could acquire through unofficial channels. At a predetermined time, he would set fire to the motor pool and communications building, creating enough chaos to pull security away from the main facility. I would have maybe 10 minutes to find Daniel, get him mobile, and reach a predetermined extraction point where Kevin would be waiting with a vehicle. 10 minutes to save my husband's life and preserve any hope of exposing the conspiracy that had destroyed our lives. There's something else, Kevin said quietly, glancing at Tommy. Once we do this, there's no going back. You'll be wanted for breaking into a federal facility, kidnapping, possibly terrorism depending on how they spin it. Your old life is over, Rachel. Completely. I thought about our house in Cedar Falls, about the mortgage payments and soccer practice and neighborhood barbecues. About my job, my colleagues, the comfortable routine of a suburban existence that now felt like it belonged to someone else entirely. My old life was over the minute I found those photographs, I said. Now I'm just choosing what comes next. We spent another 2 hours working out logistics. Kevin would take Tommy to a safe house run by a retired agent he trusted completely, someone who'd been burned by the system years ago and had no love for Blackstone or their operations. I would drive to a motel outside Charlottesville and wait for Kevin's call with the final details. One more thing, Kevin said as we prepared to leave. If this goes wrong, if I don't make it out or if something happens to the extraction plan, there's a fallback. Agent Sarah Chen in the D.C. field office. She's clean, and she's been asking questions about Daniel's disappearance that make her dangerous to Brennan's people. He handed me a business card with a phone number written on the back in pencil. Tell her everything. Give her the photographs, the financial records, the recording. Even if you don't survive this, the truth needs to get out. The weight of that responsibility settled on my shoulders like a physical burden. I wasn't just trying to save Daniel anymore. I was carrying the evidence that could expose a conspiracy reaching into the highest levels of federal law enforcement. The lives of everyone who'd been disappeared or killed to protect Blackstone's operations depended on whether I could stay alive long enough to deliver that evidence to someone who could act on it. As we walked back to our cars, Tommy between Kevin and me, I realized how much had changed since that phone call 3 nights ago. I was no longer the suburban mother who'd sat in her childhood kitchen watching families celebrate a birthday. I wasn't even the desperate woman who'd fled into the night with her son, running from dangers she couldn't understand. Now I was something else entirely. Someone willing to break into a fortified compound, to risk everything on a plan that had maybe a 30% chance of success, to become a federal fugitive if it meant saving the man I loved and exposing the truth. The transformation felt complete when Tommy hugged me goodbye outside Kevin's car, trusting completely that Mommy would be back soon, that this was all just another adventure that would end with our family back together. I held him tight, breathing in the scent of his hair, memorizing the weight of his small body against mine. Because tomorrow night, I would either be driving home with his father, or I would be dead in a Virginia mountain valley, and Tommy would grow up knowing his mother had loved him enough to risk everything for the truth. "Be good for Kevin," I whispered. "Mommy will see you soon." As I drove away, watching them disappear in my rearview mirror, I realized I'd finally found something more powerful than fear, more motivating than survival, more important than safety. I'd found purpose worth dying for. The Motel 6 outside Charlottesville smelled like industrial disinfectant and broken dreams. I'd checked in under a false name, paying cash for a room that faced the parking lot so I could see anyone approaching. The irony wasn't lost on me. 48 hours ago, I'd been a law-abiding citizen who'd never even cheated on her taxes. Now I was using surveillance techniques my FBI husband had taught me during pillow talk, preparing for what amounted to a military assault on a federal facility. Kevin's call came at 11 p.m. sharp. "Documentation is in place," he said without preamble. "Death certificate filed this morning, facility notification sent through proper channels. Your appointment is tomorrow at 2 p.m. to collect Daniel's personal effects." "And the distraction?" "Handled. I've got enough thermite to turn their motor pool into a crater and their communications array into modern art. The question is, are you ready for this?" I looked at myself in the motel room mirror. Hollow-eyed, pale, wearing clothes I'd bought at a discount store because everything I owned was back in Cedar Falls in a life that no longer existed. "I don't have a choice." "There's always a choice, Rachel. You could take Tommy and disappear. New identities, new life somewhere far from all this. I have contacts who could make it happen." "And Daniel?" Silence on the other end of the line. We both knew what would happen to Daniel if I ran. Men who operated private prisons in the mountains didn't keep witnesses alive indefinitely. 2 p.m., I repeated. "I'll be there." The facility was exactly what Kevin had described, corporate bland architecture nestled in a valley that looked like a postcard for Virginia tourism. Mountain View Corporate Center, according to the tasteful sign at the gate, offered discreet consulting services for government and private clients. The kind of vague language that could mean anything and therefore meant nothing. I drove up to the guardhouse in a rental car, wearing a black dress and dark sunglasses, playing the part of a grieving widow to perfection. The guard was young, probably ex-military based on his posture and haircut, with the kind of suspicious eyes that suggested he took his job seriously. "Mrs. Montgomery," he asked, checking my name against a clipboard. "Here for the personal effects collection?" "Yes." I kept my voice steady, professional, touched with just enough grief to be convincing. "Agent Torres said everything would be ready." The guard made a phone call, spoke in codes I couldn't decipher, then handed me a visitor's badge and a clipboard full of forms. "Building C, 3rd floor. Ms. Patterson will escort you." The drive through the facility was illuminating. What looked like a modest corporate retreat from the outside revealed itself to be something much larger and more sophisticated. Multiple buildings connected by covered walkways, satellite dishes that belonged on military installations, vehicle bays that housed armored trucks instead of company cars. This wasn't just a private security firm. This was a shadow government facility with all the resources of a federal agency and none of the oversight. Ms. Patterson met me at the entrance to Building C, a tall, severe woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to absolute authority. She examined my identification with microscopic attention, compared it to her records, and finally nodded approval. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Montgomery." Agent Montgomery's sacrifice in service to his country will not be forgotten. The words were correct, professional, completely hollow. This woman knew exactly what had happened to Daniel, and it had nothing to do with dying heroically in service to his country. "Thank you," I managed. "I just want to collect his things and go home to our son." "Of course. Everything has been carefully catalogued and secured. If you'll follow me." We took an elevator to the 3rd floor, walked down a corridor lined with unmarked doors, and finally stopped at an office that could have belonged to any mid-level bureaucrat anywhere in America. Except for the reinforced steel frame around the door and the electronic lock that required both a key card and biometric scan. "Standard security protocols," Ms. Patterson explained, noticing my attention. "We handle sensitive materials here." Inside, the office was divided into 2 sections. A reception area with chairs and a coffee table covered in magazines, and behind a glass partition, a storage area filled with metal shelving units. I could see boxes, file folders, and personal items arranged with military precision. "Agent Montgomery's effects are in Section 7, Ms. Patterson said, consulting her tablet. "I'll need you to sign for each item individually. Security requirements, I'm sure you understand." What I understood was that they were stalling, following procedures designed to keep me in this controlled environment as long as possible. Which meant Daniel was close enough that they considered my presence a potential security risk. "Actually," I said, letting my voice crack slightly, "could I use the restroom first? It's been a long drive, and I'm not handling this as well as I thought I would." Ms. Patterson's expression softened fractionally. "Of course. End of the hall, 2nd door on the right. Take your time." I walked slowly down the corridor, playing the part of a grieving widow struggling to maintain composure. But once I was out of Ms. Patterson's sight, I moved with purpose. The building directory by the elevator had shown office numbers, but more importantly, it had shown restricted areas. Basement levels marked authorized personnel only, and floor plans that didn't match the public areas I'd seen. The stairwell was deserted. I slipped off my heels and took the stairs down 2 levels, every nerve ending alive with the possibility of discovery. The basement corridor was different, institutional gray walls, fluorescent lighting, doors marked only with numbers. Behind one of those doors, I could hear voices. "Room B7. I pressed my ear to the metal surface and listened. Doesn't matter what he says, he knows. The timeline has moved up. Darkwater goes operational tomorrow night regardless of loose ends. A voice I didn't recognize, gravelly with age and authority. What about the wife? She's upstairs right now, going through the motions. That voice was familiar. Michael Brennan. She's a problem that solves itself. Once she signs the final paperwork, she becomes another casualty of her husband's classified operation. Tragic widow overwhelmed by grief, takes her own life. Very sad, very believable. My blood turned to ice. They weren't just planning to kill me here. They were planning to make it look like suicide, completing the narrative of Daniel's heroic death overseas. And the kid? Foster care. He's young enough to forget eventually. New name, new family, new life far from all this. I stopped breathing. Tommy, my beautiful, trusting son, would grow up believing his parents had abandoned him, never knowing the truth about what happened to his family. The rage that flooded through me was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Pure, focused, absolutely clear. These people hadn't just destroyed my life, they were planning to erase my family's existence entirely. I was about to move away from the door when I heard another voice. Weak, strained, but unmistakably familiar. You can kill me, but you can't kill the truth. Rachel's smarter than all of you combined. She'll figure it out. Daniel. Alive, defiant, and somewhere behind that door. I checked my watch. 2:47 p.m. Kevin's distraction was scheduled for 3:15. I had 28 minutes to get back upstairs, complete the charade with Ms. Patterson, and position myself for whatever came next. But now I knew exactly where Daniel was, and I knew the timeline for Operation Darkwater. More importantly, I knew they were planning to kill me regardless of whether I cooperated. Which meant I had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. I made it back to the restroom just as Ms. Patterson came looking for me, concern creasing her features. "Mrs. Montgomery? Are you feeling all right?" "Just needed a moment," I said, dabbing at my eyes with a tissue. "This is harder than I expected." "I understand completely. Shall we finish with the paperwork? I know you're eager to get home to your son." If only she knew how eager I was to ensure Tommy still had parents to come home to. As we walked back to her office, I began counting down the minutes until Kevin's fireworks show began. 26 minutes until the motor pool exploded. 26 minutes to maintain my cover, find a way to reach Daniel, and somehow get us both out of a facility designed specifically to prevent exactly that kind of escape. The impossible had become merely improbable. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I liked those odds. The paperwork ritual continued with excruciating precision. Ms. Patterson guided me through form after form, each one requiring my signature, my initials, my acknowledgement that I understood the classified nature of my husband's final assignment. Every few minutes, she would express sympathy for my loss, her voice carrying just the right note of professional compassion mixed with bureaucratic efficiency. "This next form confirms that all personal effects have been returned to next of kin," she explained, sliding another document across the desk. "It also acknowledges that no additional materials or information related to Agent Montgomery's assignment will be forthcoming due to national security considerations." I signed Rachel Montgomery with a steady hand while my mind raced through calculations. 3:07 p.m. 8 minutes until Kevin's distraction. The boxes of Daniel's supposed personal effects sat in the storage area behind the glass partition, clothes I recognized, a watch I'd given him for our anniversary, photographs of Tommy that must have been taken from his desk drawer. The props for this elaborate theater were disturbingly convincing. "There's one more signature required," Ms. Patterson said, producing a thicker document. "This is a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement. Standard procedure for families of agents involved in classified operations." I scanned the dense legal text, recognizing the language even though my expertise was financial rather than legal. This wasn't just a non-disclosure agreement. Buried in the subsections and whereas clauses was language that would essentially erase any legal claim I might have to investigate Daniel's death, prevent me from accessing his employment records, and absolve the government of any responsibility for providing details about his final assignment. It was a legal document designed to make me disappear from the official record as thoroughly as they'd made Daniel disappear from the world. "This seems quite comprehensive," I said, letting uncertainty creep into my voice. "I'm not sure I understand all the implications." Ms. Patterson leaned forward with practiced sympathy. "I know it's overwhelming, Mrs. Montgomery. Legal documents always are, especially when you're grieving. But this simply protects both you and the agency from any future complications. It ensures your husband's sacrifice remains honorable and untainted by speculation or media attention. What if I need time to have a lawyer review this?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Ms. Patterson's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered behind her eyes. "I'm afraid that's not possible. These documents contain classified information that cannot leave this facility. The signature must be completed here, today, as part of the materials release process." 3:11 p.m. 4 minutes. I picked up the pen, made a show of reading the signature line, then set it down again. "I'm sorry, I'm having trouble focusing. Could I get a glass of water?" "Of course." Ms. Patterson stood, moved to a small refrigerator in the corner of the office. Her back was to me for perhaps 10 seconds, but it was enough. I slipped the small recording device Kevin had given me under the desk, activated the magnetic attachment Daniel had taught me about during one of his stories about surveillance techniques. If nothing else, there would be a record of what happened in this room. "Thank you," I said, accepting the water and taking a deliberate sip. "I think I'm ready to finish this now." 3:13 p.m. I signed the final document just as the building's fire alarm began to wail. Ms. Patterson's head snapped up, confusion replacing her practiced calm. Through the office window, I could see smoke beginning to rise from somewhere across the compound. Kevin's distraction had begun exactly on schedule. "Please remain seated," Ms. Patterson said, moving quickly to her desk phone. But before she could lift the receiver, the lights went out. Emergency lighting kicked in a second later, bathing everything in an eerie red glow. The fire alarm continued its piercing shriek, and now I could hear shouting from somewhere in the building below us. "Standard evacuation procedures," Ms. Patterson announced, but her voice carried a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. She tried the phone again, no dial tone. 3:14 p.m. Through the window, I could see the motor pool had become an inferno. Vehicles were exploding one by one in a chain reaction that lit up the late afternoon sky. Security personnel were running toward the fire, abandoning their posts exactly as Kevin had predicted. "We need to evacuate the building," Ms. Patterson said, but she was looking at me with suspicion now, as if my presence and the emergency were somehow connected. Which, of course, they were. "What about my husband's things?" I asked, gesturing toward the storage area. "I can't leave without them. The items will be secured in." The building shook as something large exploded outside. The communications tower, based on the direction of the blast. Kevin wasn't just creating a distraction, he was systematically crippling the facility's ability to coordinate a response. Ms. Patterson grabbed her radio from the desk, tried to make contact with security. Static was her only answer. That's when I made my move. "I need to get to my husband," I said, dropping all pretense of grief and confusion. "And you're going to help me?" She spun around, reaching for something in her desk drawer, but I was already moving. Years of watching Daniel practice hand-to-hand combat techniques in our garage had taught me the basics. I grabbed her wrist before she could draw whatever weapon she was reaching for, used her own momentum to slam her hand against the desktop. The gun, a small pistol that would have been perfectly adequate for executing an unarmed widow, skittered across the floor. "Daniel Montgomery," I said, applying pressure to the joint locks Daniel had taught me. "Where is he?" "You're making a terrible mistake," Ms. Patterson gasped. "You have no idea what you're interfering with. Basement level 2, room B7. I know exactly where he is." I increased the pressure until she winced. "What I need from you is the access codes." "I don't have." Another explosion rocked the building. Closer this time, maybe the generator building. The emergency lighting flickered and died, leaving us in darkness broken only by the orange glow from the fires outside. "The codes," I repeated. "Or we can sit here in the dark until this building burns down around us." Ms. Patterson's resistance crumbled along with the facility's infrastructure. She gave me the access codes, the location of the main server room, and most importantly, confirmation that Daniel was being held in the basement medical facility. "He's injured," she admitted as I zip-tied her hands with restraints from her own desk drawer. "Shot trying to escape 3 days ago. He may not be mobile." The information hit me like a physical blow, but I couldn't afford to process it now. Daniel was alive but wounded, 2 floors below me in a building that was rapidly becoming a war zone. I had maybe 10 minutes before backup security arrived from wherever Blackstone kept their emergency response teams. 10 minutes to find Daniel, get him mobile, and reach the extraction point where Kevin would be waiting. As I left Ms. Patterson secured in her own office and headed for the stairwell, the building shook again from another explosion. Kevin was keeping his promise to create chaos, but chaos was a double-edged sword. The same confusion that would help me reach Daniel would also make it nearly impossible to get him out safely. But for the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't running from the danger anymore. I was running toward the man I loved, and nothing short of death was going to stop me from bringing him home. The stairwell was filled with smoke and the sound of alarms, but it was also empty. Every security guard in the facility was either fighting fires or trying to restore communications, exactly as Kevin had calculated. As I descended toward the basement levels where my husband was being held, one thought burned in my mind brighter than all the fires Kevin had set outside. They had underestimated what a forensic accountant could do when she stopped following the rules and started writing her own. That was going to be the last mistake they ever made. The basement corridor was a maze of identical doors and flickering emergency lights, each step echoing in the smoke-filled air like a countdown to disaster. The access codes Ms. Patterson had given me worked on the security door at the bottom of the stairwell, but now I faced a hallway that stretched in both directions with no indication of which way led to room B7. I chose left, moving as quickly as I dared while trying to stay silent. The building continued to shake from Kevin's systematic destruction of the facility's infrastructure, and through the ventilation system, I could hear the distant sound of sirens. Backup was coming, which meant my window of opportunity was shrinking by the minute. Room B3. B4. B5. Each door was identical, reinforced steel with electronic locks and small observation windows made of bulletproof glass. I peered through each one, seeing empty cells that looked more like hospital rooms than offices, medical equipment, restraint systems, the sterile functionality of a place designed to hold people against their will. Room B6 contained a man I didn't recognize, unconscious on a medical gurney with 4 lines running into his arms. Another victim of whatever Blackstone was doing in this basement. Room B7. Through the observation window, I saw Daniel propped against the far wall, his left shoulder bandaged and his face bearing the bruises of recent violence. But he was conscious, alert, and when he saw my face in the window, his expression transformed from resignation to disbelief to desperate hope. The access code worked. The lock disengaged with a soft click that sounded as loud as thunder in the smoke-filled corridor. Rachel? Daniel's voice was hoarse, strained, but unmistakably alive. What the hell are you doing here? I ran to him, my hands checking for injuries while my eyes catalogued the medical equipment keeping him stable. Saving your life. Can you move? I can move. But you need to get out of here. This whole place is. Kevin Torres is outside blowing things up to cover our escape. We have maybe 5 minutes before security regroups. I helped him to his feet, noting how he favored his injured shoulder. Can you run? I can do whatever I need to do to get us out of here. Daniel's voice was stronger now, fueled by adrenaline and the desperate hope of escape. But Rachel, you don't understand what you've walked into. Blackstone isn't just a private security firm. I know what they are. I know about Operation Darkwater. I know Michael Brennan has been using my financial analyses to protect their operations. And I know they're planning to kill all of us to cover their tracks. Daniel stared at me for a moment, processing the implications of how much I'd learned in the few days since his disappearance. Then you know we can't just run. Even if we get out of here, they'll hunt us down. They have resources, connections, the ability to make people disappear permanently. Another explosion rocked the building, closer than the others. The lights flickered and went out completely, leaving us in darkness broken only by the orange glow seeping through the ventilation system. Not if we expose them first, I said, helping Daniel toward the door. I have recordings, photographs, financial records that prove everything. Agent Sarah Chen in the DC field office is clean. If we can get the evidence to her. Chen's dead. Daniel's words hit me like a physical blow. Killed in a car accident yesterday morning. Made to look like she fell asleep at the wheel after working a double shift. The news staggered me. Kevin had said Chen was our backup plan, our insurance policy if everything went wrong. Without her, the evidence I'd collected was just paper and digital files that could be dismissed or suppressed by the same system that had created this nightmare. Then we go public, I said, refusing to let despair slow us down. Media, internet, congressional committees. Make enough noise that they can't silence all of us. We reached the corridor, Daniel moving slowly but steadily despite his injuries. The smoke was thicker now, and through the ventilation system, I could hear new sounds, boots on concrete, radio chatter, the organized movement of security teams regrouping. They're coming, Daniel whispered. Extraction route? Kevin's waiting at the north perimeter fence. We need to reach the service tunnel that connects to the storm drain system. That's 3 buildings away through open ground. In our condition, under fire, that's not a plan. That's suicide. I thought about Tommy, safe with Kevin's contact but waiting for parents who might never come home. I thought about all the other families destroyed by Blackstone's operations, all the victims whose stories would never be told if we didn't survive to tell them. Do you have a better idea? Daniel checked his watch. Somehow, he'd managed to keep it through his captivity. Actually, I do. But you're not going to like it. He led me deeper into the basement, away from the stairwell and toward what looked like a dead end. But when he pressed his hand against a seemingly blank section of wall, a hidden panel slid aside, revealing another corridor. Emergency evacuation route, he explained. I spent 3 days mapping this place before they caught me. Every government facility has hidden exits, even the unofficial ones. This leads to a tunnel system that connects to the main highway about a mile from here. The hidden corridor was narrow, utilitarian, designed for emergency use rather than comfort. We moved as quickly as Daniel's injuries would allow, guided by emergency lighting that flickered intermittently as the building's power systems failed. Behind us, I could hear voices echoing through the main corridor. Security teams were conducting a systematic search, and it was only a matter of time before they found the hidden entrance. There's something else you need to know, Daniel said as we navigated a junction where the corridor split in 3 directions. Operation Darkwater isn't just about eliminating witnesses. It's the final phase of something much larger. Larger how? Blackstone has been using government resources to fund a private army. Not just security contractors, but a full military force with advanced weapons, intelligence capabilities, and the financial resources of a small nation. They've been planning a complete takeover of certain federal law enforcement functions. The implications hit me like a freight train. A coup? A privatization. Make the government so dependent on Blackstone's services that they become indispensable, then gradually assume control of critical functions. Counterterrorism, intelligence gathering, domestic security, all of it transferred to private contractors accountable to no one. We reached another junction, this one with a ladder leading upward. Daniel checked his watch again. Darkwater goes operational tomorrow night with a series of terrorist attacks designed to justify expanded security measures. Attacks that Blackstone will be perfectly positioned to prevent and investigate. Attacks they're planning themselves. False flag operations on a scale that will make 9/11 look like a warm-up exercise. And once the public demands increased security at any cost, Blackstone steps in as the savior. I climbed the ladder first, emerging into what appeared to be a maintenance shed somewhere on the facility's grounds. Through a grimy window, I could see the main buildings burning in the distance, Kevin's handiwork continuing to provide cover for our escape. We have to stop them, I said as Daniel emerged from the tunnel. Whatever it takes, we have to prevent those attacks. The evidence you collected might be enough to do it. If we can get it to the right people, if we can survive long enough to tell our story. Daniel trailed off as headlights swept across the shed's windows. 3 vehicles were approaching fast, their searchlights probing every shadow. Security teams spreading out to cover the perimeter, cutting off our escape routes one by one. The extraction point, I said. Kevin's waiting. Kevin's good, but he's one man against a private army. And they know we're out here now. I checked my phone. No signal. The facility's jamming equipment was either still functional or Kevin's explosions had taken out the cell towers along with everything else. We were on our own, injured and exhausted, facing professional killers with unlimited resources and the kind of government connections that could make our deaths look like anything they wanted them to look like. But we were also carrying the evidence that could expose the greatest conspiracy in American history. Evidence that could prevent terrorist attacks designed to enslave the country to private security interests. As the vehicles closed in and the searchlights swept closer to our hiding place, I realized the game had changed one final time. We weren't just running for our lives anymore. We were running to save democracy itself. The searchlights were sweeping methodically across the maintenance area, each pass bringing them closer to our hiding spot. Daniel pressed against the shed's back wall, his breathing labored from pain and exertion, while I peered through a crack in the wooden siding at the approaching vehicles. 3 black SUVs had formed a perimeter around the maintenance complex, their occupants moving with military precision as they established a containment zone. These weren't the facility's regular security guards, these were Blackstone's elite tactical team, the kind of operators who specialized in making problems disappear permanently. "We need another way out," I whispered, scanning the shed's interior for options. Tools, spare parts, maintenance equipment, nothing that would help us against professional killers with military-grade weapons. Daniel was examining something near the floor, a metal grate that looked like it might lead to another tunnel system. "Storm drain," he said quietly. "Connects to the same network as the emergency exit, but it comes out closer to the highway. Can you make it through there with your shoulder?" "I can make it through anything if it means getting you home to Tommy." The grate was secured with 4 bolts that had been painted over so many times they looked like part of the metal itself. I searched through the maintenance supplies until I found a crowbar, then began working on the first bolt as quietly as possible. Outside, I could hear radio chatter as the search teams coordinated their sweep pattern. They were being thorough, professional, taking their time because they knew we were trapped in this area with nowhere else to run. The first bolt came free with a soft squeal of metal. The second one was more stubborn, requiring leverage that made noise I was sure they could hear from outside. "Movement in Shed 7, a voice called from somewhere too close. Thermal imaging shows heat signatures." I froze, crowbar in hand, as footsteps approached the shed door. Daniel motioned for me to keep working while he positioned himself beside the entrance, ready to fight with whatever strength his injuries had left him. The door handle turned slowly. That's when the night exploded with the sound of automatic weapons fire from the direction of the main facility. Not the controlled explosions Kevin had been setting, but the rapid-fire chaos of a sustained firefight. "All units, respond to the main building," came the radio command. "Multiple shooters, heavy casualties. Priority 1, defend the data center." The footsteps outside our shed moved away quickly, boots pounding toward the new crisis. Through the grimy window, I watched 2 of the SUVs race back toward the burning buildings, their searchlights sweeping away from our hiding spot. "Kevin," Daniel said grimly. "He's drawing them off, but that's not sustainable. He's one man against their entire security force." I got the 3rd bolt loose, then the 4th. The grate lifted away, revealing a concrete tunnel that disappeared into darkness. The smell that wafted up was a mixture of stagnant water and industrial runoff, but it was our only chance. "You first," I told Daniel. "I'll cover our exit." He lowered himself into the tunnel with visible effort, his injured shoulder making the movement awkward and painful. I followed, pulling the grate back into position above us and hoping it would delay discovery of our escape route. The storm drain was larger than I'd expected, tall enough to walk upright in most places, with a steady trickle of water flowing along the bottom. Emergency lighting was sporadic, leaving long stretches of absolute darkness where we had to feel our way forward along the concrete walls. "Half a mile," Daniel said, consulting his mental map of the facility's layout. "Maybe less to the highway drainage outlet." We moved as quickly as the conditions allowed, Daniel's breathing growing more labored with each step. The bandage on his shoulder was showing signs of fresh bleeding, and I knew he was running on adrenaline and willpower more than physical strength. Behind us, echoing through the tunnel system, came the distant sound of the firefight continuing. Kevin was keeping his promise to create maximum chaos, but every burst of gunfire meant he was deeper in danger, facing odds that no one could survive indefinitely. There, Daniel pointed ahead to where a faint glow indicated the tunnel's exit. "Highway drainage. From there, we can." The sound of boots splashing through water behind us cut him off. They'd found the tunnel entrance. "Contact in the storm system," a voice echoed off the concrete walls. 2 subjects moving toward Highway 7 outlet. I grabbed Daniel's good arm and we ran, abandoning stealth for speed as pursuit closed in behind us. The tunnel exit was a concrete archway that opened onto a steep embankment leading up to the highway. Through the opening, I could see the headlights of late-night traffic moving past, normal people living normal lives completely unaware of the shadow war being fought in the darkness below them. We emerged from the tunnel just as the first tactical team reached the halfway point behind us. The embankment was slick with rain and runoff, making the climb treacherous in the best conditions. With Daniel's injuries and our pursuers closing in, it felt like an insurmountable obstacle. "Go," Daniel said, pushing me toward the slope. "I'll buy you time." I'm not leaving you. You have to. The evidence, Tommy, everything depends on you getting out of here. Before I could argue, he was moving back toward the tunnel entrance, using his good arm to position himself behind a concrete barrier where he could make a stand. I saw him pick up a piece of rebar from the construction debris scattered around the drainage area, a pathetically inadequate weapon against trained killers with automatic rifles. But it would have to be enough. I climbed the embankment as fast as I could, grabbing onto roots and rocks for leverage, my dress tearing on the rough concrete and vegetation. Behind me, I heard the first gunshots as Daniel engaged the pursuit team, buying precious seconds with his own blood. At the top of the embankment, I flagged down the first vehicle I saw, a pickup truck driven by a man in his 60s who took one look at my condition and didn't ask questions. Hospital, I gasped as I climbed into the passenger seat. There's been an accident. As we pulled away from the drainage area, I looked back to see muzzle flashes in the darkness below. Daniel was still fighting, still alive, still giving me the chance to escape with the evidence that could expose everything. But I knew I couldn't save him by running away. I grabbed the driver's cell phone and dialed 911, reporting a terrorist attack at the Mountain View Corporate Center, multiple casualties, federal agents under fire. Then I called the Washington Post, the New York Times, every news organization I could think of, feeding them the same story with enough detail to make it credible. If Daniel and I were going to die tonight, we were going to die making so much noise that Blackstone's conspiracy would be exposed in the aftermath. The driver's radio was tuned to a news station, and within minutes, the first reports were coming in. Federal facility under attack in Virginia. Multiple explosions reported. Emergency services responding to reports of gunfire and casualties. The story was out, spreading faster than Blackstone could contain it. Whatever happened to us now, the world was watching. In my purse, the recording device Kevin had given me held conversations that could destroy everyone involved in the conspiracy. The photographs and financial records I'd mailed to multiple locations would surface eventually, providing irrefutable proof of the corruption network. Operation Darkwater might still go forward tomorrow night, but it would no longer serve its purpose. The attacks Blackstone had planned to justify their takeover would instead expose them as the architects of terrorism they'd claimed to be fighting. As we reached the highway and drove toward the glow of civilization in the distance, I realized we'd already won the most important victory. The truth was out, spreading like wildfire through the very communication networks Blackstone had thought they controlled. Now all that remained was surviving long enough to see justice done. 6 months later, I stood in a federal courthouse in Washington, D.C., watching the last of Blackstone's senior leadership being led away in handcuffs. The trial had lasted 3 weeks, and every day had brought new revelations about the scope of their conspiracy. Arms trafficking, money laundering, planned terrorist attacks, the systematic corruption of federal law enforcement. The evidence I'd collected that night had unraveled a network that reached into the highest levels of government. Michael Brennan had been sentenced to 45 years without parole. 12 other federal agents received prison terms ranging from 15 to 30 years. The mysterious director turned out to be Deputy Attorney General Patricia Vance, a woman I'd met at office Christmas parties who'd smiled at me over cocktails while planning my family's murder. But the victory felt hollow without the people who'd made it possible. Kevin Torres had died in the firefight at the Mountain View facility, taking 7 Blackstone operatives with him before they finally brought him down. He'd bought us 20 crucial minutes with his life, 20 minutes that had allowed the story to break before they could suppress it. His funeral drew hundreds of law enforcement officers who'd learned the truth about the corruption he'd died fighting. The pickup truck driver who'd helped me escape, a retired Army sergeant named James Mitchell, had refused all offers of reward money. Just doing what any decent person would do, he'd said. But he'd accepted my invitation to testify at the congressional hearings, where his simple honesty had been more powerful than hours of expert testimony. Daniel survived his wounds, but the recovery had been long and difficult. 3 surgeries to repair the damage to his shoulder, months of physical therapy, and the kind of psychological counseling that comes after surviving torture at the hands of your own government. He'd returned to work at the FBI, but in a new role, heading up an internal affairs unit specifically tasked with preventing another Blackstone from taking root in federal law enforcement. "Mom, they're starting," Tommy called from across the courthouse steps, where he'd been playing with a group of other children whose families had been affected by the conspiracy. At 9 years old now, he understood more than I wished he had to about the events that had changed our lives. But he'd also learned lessons about courage, integrity, and standing up for what's right that would serve him well for the rest of his life. The press conference was brief. FBI Director Sarah Williams, Agent Chen's replacement and a woman whose integrity was beyond question, announced the final convictions and outlined the reforms being implemented to prevent future corruption. The financial tracking systems I'd helped design were now standard protocol for all federal agencies. The kind of shell company manipulation that had funded Blackstone's operations would be much harder to hide in the future. But the real changes went deeper than procedures and protocols. The events of the past year have shown us that the greatest threat to American security doesn't always come from foreign enemies, Director Williams said, looking directly into the cameras. Sometimes it comes from within our own institutions, from people who exploit the trust placed in them by the American people. Today's convictions represent not just justice for those who were harmed, but a commitment to the transparency and accountability that must define law enforcement in a free society. After the cameras stopped rolling, Daniel and I walked to the Vietnam Memorial, where Kevin's name had been added to a special section honoring federal agents killed in the line of duty. Tommy placed a small American flag beside the fresh engraving, his 9-year-old solemnity breaking my heart and filling me with pride at the same time. "He saved us," Tommy said simply. "That's what heroes do." We drove home to Cedar Falls that afternoon, to the same house where this nightmare had begun 6 months earlier. The media attention had been intense for weeks after the story broke, but it had faded as new crises captured public attention. That was fine with me. I'd never wanted to be famous for surviving a conspiracy. I just wanted my family to be safe and the truth to be known. The neighborhood looked exactly the same as it had the night I'd fled with Tommy, but everything felt different. The false sense of security that had defined my suburban life was gone, replaced by something more valuable, the knowledge that democracy requires constant vigilance, and that ordinary citizens sometimes have to do extraordinary things to protect it. I'd returned to my work as a forensic accountant, but with a new focus. The consulting firm I'd started specialized in investigating financial crimes involving government contracts. It was satisfying work, using the skills that had nearly gotten me killed to prevent other families from going through what we'd endured. Daniel came home that evening carrying Chinese takeout and wearing the expression of someone who'd had a good day at work. The internal affairs unit he led had uncovered 3 separate corruption schemes in the past month, small-scale operations compared to Blackstone, but each one representing families that wouldn't have to face what we'd faced. "Any regrets?" he asked as we sat down to dinner, a question he'd been asking regularly since the trials ended. "About what?" "Destroying a terrorist network, saving democracy, keeping our family alive?" I smiled at him across the kitchen table where this had all started. "No regrets. Though I could have done without the part where you got shot. I could have done without the part where my wife had to break into a federal facility to rescue me." Tommy looked up from his lo mein. "I thought that was pretty cool. Mom's like a superhero, but with math." "Forensic accounting," I corrected. "And it's not exactly superhero material. It is when you use it to catch bad guys." Later that night, after Tommy was asleep, Daniel and I sat on our back porch watching the stars. The same stars that had been shining the night I'd fled this house with our son, not knowing if we'd ever see home again. "The new task force is requesting permanent funding," Daniel said. "Full authorization to investigate corruption at any level of federal law enforcement." "That's good." Kevin would have liked that. He would have liked knowing his sacrifice mattered. I thought about the recording device that had captured Michael Brennan's confession, about the photographs that had exposed an arms trafficking network, about the financial records that had unraveled a conspiracy reaching into the highest levels of government. Evidence that had cost good people their lives but had ultimately saved countless others. It did matter, I said. All of it mattered. A year ago, if someone had told me that my quiet life as a suburban mother and forensic accountant would be shattered by a phone call from my FBI husband, I'd have laughed. If they'd told me I'd end up breaking into a federal facility, surviving assassination attempts, and testifying before Congress, I'd have suggested they seek professional help. But sometimes ordinary people get called to do extraordinary things. Sometimes the survival of everything you believe in depends on whether you're willing to risk everything you love to protect it. As I held Daniel's hand and listened to the familiar sounds of our neighborhood settling into sleep, I realized I wouldn't change any of it. Not the fear, not the pain, not the moments when death seemed certain. Because all of it had led to this moment, this quiet evening with my family intact and the truth finally exposed. The phone on the kitchen counter remained silent. No urgent calls, no desperate warnings, no voices from the shadows demanding impossible choices. Just peace, earned through courage and paid for with sacrifice, but genuine and lasting in hours. In the distance, a church bell chimed midnight, marking the end of another day in a democracy that had survived because some people were willing to fight for it. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new cases to investigate, new threats to vigilance. But tonight, my family was home, the truth had prevailed, and America was a little bit safer because ordinary citizens had chosen to become extraordinary when everything that mattered was at stake. That was enough. That was everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.